Let me turn next to Karel Lannoo, the Chief Executive of CEPS. Karel, let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and also thank you to CER, let's say, that we can do this event together. I think we did it last year, we did it, I think, almost at the same time. We do it this time again. I think it's always useful to do this and also to have this cooperation between think tanks at European level, because we can all learn from each other. My thoughts, let's say, on your Lisbon scorecard, of course, go on the area which I follow most, which is the financial market, but this, I think, which is still the most topical issue, let's say, we can speak about today. Just if we think about, if I see the scorecard now, then if I think about the early 2000s, I see the Commission, at that time, commissioned a study on how can we kind of justify the single financial market, how can we justify the Financial Services Action Plan, and at the time they commissioned a study from London Economics, which I think was published in 2001, 2002, which said or came out with figures that the benefit of the Financial Services Action Plan would be something like 1 or 2% of GDP. However, what have we seen in the meantime is that apparently we had until 2007 a very well-functioning financial sector, which probably contributed also to a large extent to economic growth, but then, let's say, came the financial crisis. And in the meantime, the Commission has published figures on that. Let's say the cost of this financial crisis has been something like 10 to 12% of GDP, 10 to 12% of GDP, only in state aid which has been granted, let's say, to the financial sector. This does not include, for example, quantitative easing, which has been used by certain banks. Of course, you can include this, and, for example, the Bank of England has published figures on that, but it, of course, depends on, let's say, how the financial markets will recover at a later stage. But anyway, let's say we also have seen, let's say, that the cost of this crisis, which is to some extent, certainly in the eyes of the public opinion, caused by the banks, has been enormous on the economies, and the President of the Commission was just saying this. In fact, let's say I think the overall reduction in economic growth is something like 3 to 4% last year. So, and public opinion will say this is the financial sector, this is bad regulation, to which probably in their eyes also the EU or EU's regulation has contributed. I mean, the EU has acted on that, and probably after some lack of some hesitation, they have come out with this de Larosière report, which you mentioned also in your report, and I think, let's say, it has gone forward fairly well. Let's say they have now established this new institutional structure, this European supervisory authorities, or, I mean, to just strengthen the cooperation between the supervisors, which you also highlight in your report, let's say, was somewhere missing. They are establishing this European Systemic Risk Board, which also the President mentioned, which will be operational very soon. In fact, let's say the decisions on both measures have been taken by the Council. The things are at the moment in the hands of the Parliament. Parliament wants to go further, but I think overall it's the good step to take. Let's say we had to strengthen the single market in financial services, certainly the cooperation between supervisory authorities. On top of that, we have a whole set of regulatory measures which in fact follow very closely what the G20 is doing. And I would echo the remarks which the President said. Apparently, certainly in some member states, the consensus or the momentum behind the G20 measures is receding somewhat. The Commission has in fact very closely followed what the G20 proposed, and was probably on a global level one of the first to act. And there are even tensions, let's say today, let's say with, for example, the United States, that on things which were, I think, for example, the hedge funds directive, where the Commission is following what the G20 asked. The G20 said we will regulate all products, markets, institutions. And then apparently last week there was a letter to Commissioner Barnier from Tim Geithner complaining about a provision in that directive which calls for equivalent measures in other states, which I don't think, let's say, should be a problem if you follow the G20 commitment and if you say, look, we will regulate all different forms of financial institutions, which also includes hedge funds. But that's at European level, and probably there's still more to come. What has been another effect of this financial crisis, and something which we certainly regret, let's say, is that there has been a negative impact on the single market. And a negative impact on the single market, which we can kind of distinguish two different measures. First of all, some member states have started to take measures on their own and have, let's say, not even consulted the EU and have done, I mean, we in the past spoke about gold plating. No, it's even worse than gold plating. I don't know how we would call it. There's one member state like the UK, and I would kind of, I would criticize this in public. The UK, which is, arguing always so much here in Brussels that the EU should consult, they should consult market participants, has enacted two measures over the last 6 months without even consulting the EU. Two measures where they impose, for example, a liquidity ratio for banks which they have just imposed across the board. I just still don't know how they will impose it on host country banks. I simply imagine they will do it, but they have certainly not consulted the EU, not waited for the EU or the EU measures which are now on the table. That was in October last year. Also this month they have enacted a new regulation for living wills, meaning contingency planning in banks, where again the EU is working on something, but they have not consulted the EU. And this then comes from the member states which in fact benefits most, I think, from a well-functioning single market, but which is, I don't know why, probably under strong pressure from its own public opinion, enacting measures without even consulting the EU, and which I think go clearly against the single market and without waiting for what the EU will do. A second element of that is that where has the single market also receded? We all know it. It's the state aid decisions in the banking sector. First of all, the state aid plans which have been adopted over, I would say, from October 2008 until probably the end of last year. We've seen, let's say, we have analyzed many of these plans. We'll bring out a report on that very soon. But if you look at many of the conditions for state aids, it was in fact very much against the single market very often. Let's say banks were given aid by their national legislators to help, let's say, to restore their financial stability, to restore the financial market at a national level, not at European level. So sometimes they simply disregarded the effects on the single market. We have also seen what is the impact of some state aid decisions which have been taken in the meantime by the Commission. The first one was, I think, on ING in October last year. In the meantime, there have been more. If you analyze some of these decisions, you see that the Commission is in fact sometimes against its own spirit, asking some of these banks to disinvest in other EU jurisdictions just to restore their financial health, but something which to many observers is seen to be to some extent contradictory. What we also see in the banking sector is that many banks have, as a result of this crisis, started to focus again on their core business, and in many cases their core business was their core home market, and again not only awaiting state aid decisions, or for banks which have not received state aid, they have gone back to their home market, and again a step back to this more integrated single financial market. So my overall view is that I think a result of these, the financial crisis, I think, let's say, overall with citizens at large, the trust in the financial sector has been greatly affected, and certainly also the trust in foreign banks. So most citizens will prefer, let's say, to do banking with banks which are within their own jurisdictions, which are well known, and will not necessarily go any longer to foreign banks. You mentioned also a case which is very well known in the UK, the Icelandic banks. I think it has been very widely discussed in the media all over, not only in two countries, the Netherlands and the UK, but also in the Nordic countries, in Germany and Luxembourg and Belgium. It's been a flagrant case, in fact, of a non-well-functioning single market, simply because these banks were benefiting from the single market, participating in free branching, but in fact not having the means to support what they were doing. The deposit guarantee system, which should back up, let's say, what the banks were doing, apparently was not capable of supporting the activities in these foreign jurisdictions. So what is my overall, conclusion from that, Charles? From a single market perspective, what we see is that the financial crisis was a step back. I think there will be less integration, there will be less cross-border activity, and certainly less cross-border activity through branches. You also referred to the Turner report in that regard. There will be more gold plating to come. I mentioned these two examples. So the big question now is these measures which are being discussed as well at the institutional, at the regulatory level within the EU. Will they restore trust? I cannot say it now. I think overall they are good measures, but it will take some years, and I speak for at least 2 or 3 years, to probably have the degree of integration which we had before the crisis started. Probably one recommendation I could make to the report, if you could also a bit closer look at the